Hello and most welcome to 825, that is. I will today talk about emotional regulation and what that is. It's so interesting. This is actually the bordering line between neurology and what one could call therapeutical work, or the work of the pragmatists like William James or Dyer, Frank Pierce, maybe it's a good name as well. And it's sort of interesting because now we are getting into the gooey, nice, blood-filled stuff. This is, I would say, is the direction that Heidegger and the philosophers of the continent was sort of hinting at. Go that way. Well, it makes for a change to analytical philosophy, being about absurd things like brain in a vat, or my absolute favorite, the Gettier problem. Gettier problem is something that would not ever in reality become a problem. Wow, well, that goes for brain in the vat as well. Sorry about my digression. Let's cut to the chase and go to the point. Emotional regulation. Well, take a kid, for instance. A little kid doesn't have any emotional regulation. It just reacts. No controlling mechanism is established, and whatever happens internally or externally, the kid just reacts. Actually, if the kid is very young, it won't even make a difference between internal and an external world. It's just the same, you just react. Emotional regulation is the most important development point when you are 4, 5, 6, somewhere in that vicinity. And how good you get at it, that is something that will determine how successful you become with your things in life. When I say successful, I mean in all dimensions: emotionally, socially, economically, career-wise, but also might even more important than career-wise, thinking-wise, how your brain will develop. I mentioned earlier about this neuroplasticity. And if you're not able to do effective emotional regulation, that will also affect how the brain develops and how it looks in a scan. Yes, you can actually see in a scan, and you don't even have to be too skilled to see the difference between a child who did not succeed at all in his or her emotional regulation and the effects on the brain, because that kid is going to bump into every area of reality: social interaction, what the kid thinks, the kid's inner world, maybe more importantly, how it feels internally, and also planning, doing things. And this is quite a massive expansion of what I mentioned before with the Marsh model experience. That's a very simple sort of emotional regulation. It was done in the 60s in the United States, and small kids about this age, as I mentioned, before any good emotional regulation was established, were presented with a marshmallow, and they were told if they wait 2 minutes they would get another one. That's an external emotional regulation, but later, well, maybe only a year later in that development, the kid needs to do internal emotional regulation, needs to understand how to postpone emotion until they are fitting. Or the kid also needs to understand different modes, how they change during the day. There is a tremendous change, and a lot of development of intelligence and emotional skill has to do with how we changes, how the changes evolves during the day. From the early morning, in the normal morning, lunch, afternoon, evening, going to bed and all that. We're all different. Some kids learn how they are different and can adjust and postpone things that are not suited for the day of the time of the day. Other kids try to do everything at once, and that is bound to failure in the end. That's not learning the system's own regulation. So the whole idea is getting into sync the controlling mechanism with the flow of the body/mind. And far from what could be unintentionally implied here by the subject, not by me, is that changes, those things are very different from every and each person. To some extent, yes, but there are huge similarities, and because of our special development in the West, and here is something you can actually point to in language. We have very few words to categorize, to describe, to pinpoint, and those words are extremely important in the context. There's also lacking a lot of knowledge in the area, knowledge that, for instance, in India, it's been noted down already in the Pali verses, or even earlier in the Mahabharata, or the writings of Samkhya. One of those things I mentioned before is the relationship between the intellectual capacity, or whatever you would call it, body, and the ahamkara, the ego. And the ego could be said to be the one who wants to do everything immediately, wants the ice cream now, before dinner, so forth. Whereas the body is the regulating force to say, let's take the ice cream or the banana or the candy after lunch. And as you see, with this development, in the end, it might become that you receive your candy only on Saturdays. And the reason for we having candies on Saturdays, I do not think it has to do with only giving the kid candy once a week. That's a part of it, but that's not the important part. The reason is regulation. And that's sort of information you have to find elsewhere, because it's not in the oral or literal tradition of the West, because of different reasons that we all know about. But you can find them. There we have certain people who gather their own information from scratch, which is tougher, start from scratch. But one of those books I really was found about was something I read 3 years ago. I'll try to find the title. It's something to the extent of, why do not French kids cry at night? And it's written by an American. She was working in Paris, and she noticed that the French kids were much calmer than her own kids or American kids in general. And she realized there was a huge regulation going on already implicitly in the French society. And one of those things were cake bake day. The kid baked a cake with one of the parents. And the amazing thing that completely gobsmacked her was the fact that the kid did not even eat the cake once it was ready. So you see here, it's an attitude of letting go and not seeing that it's something higher than the ahamkara, and maybe a sort of implicit insight from the French not to make the poor kid a complete victim of an unruled ahamkara, an unruled ego. And this is exactly what emotional regulation is about. I think when she wrote the book, that was not yet an established term. She wasn't aware of it. It is, all these things are extremely new. It's possibly the first time you will hear about these things, but they are very interesting and they are extremely helpful. I would say we've come so far in this exploration that we can now go into the really practical details that pay off a more James Clarion vision of the whole thing. What could emotional regulation be with an adult? Well, we just started our exploration into the new area, terra incognita, of the inner world. We are the explorers. We are traveling with Santa Maria, Pinto and the third vessel, and we find a new continent, and that's our own inner world. And we are bound to discover and uncover an amazing, interesting world. And this is going to be with you until the day you die, because this is what development really is about. This is where what the continental philosophers were pointing to. They tried to show us the way out of the bottle. We were flies flying around, obsessed possibly with analytical philosophy or something else that is impossible to put to good use. But they can still trap us. Once we're out of the trap, we can start doing things. One thing that really struck me that most interesting is something I heard over a YouTube channel. Emma McNabb, an American family therapist in the pragmatic tradition from William James and Peirce and so forth. There is a huge tendency, oddly enough, in the United States to be very practical about these things. They have actually some sort of tradition into doing these things. And one of her suggestions was, do not start too early to check your mails or your SMS. Why is that? They can actually contain marvelous discoveries and interesting information, and it can give you a positive energy for the day. It could be for somebody you think is important, or a dear friend, or something like that. Yes, that's true. But the thing is, you should start the day with your own intention. You should give yourself some time to decide for yourself and take that stimuli later, maybe after coffee or after lunch even. Because if you start every day with your own intention, that intention will grow day by day, and it's coming from yourself. And you still have those interesting discoveries from the emails or whatever they are, or responses, commentaries, you name it, it could be anything. So And by doing that, at least giving yourself 1 hour of me time, your self time, you continue the journey to the inner world of discovering yourself, because this is strictly about yourself and no one else. And I think this is also a way into understanding others, because if you don't do this emotional regulation, which is quite common today, you end up getting problems with everything around you, and in the end you give other people up as well, because it's just too complicated. You don't know how you react to others, you can't judge that, you don't know what mood you yourself is in, state you're in. But it's not that odd. It's like owning a horse. You need to know when the horse is strong and how you encourage it. This is yourself. You need to learn the horse. And the horse, we all know, is strongest in the morning. And that doesn't go for all horses. It's usually strongest in the morning, bodily force. But when it comes to showing the horse something, it's better in the afternoon, because it's more malleable then. To much more complicated degree, that is true with us as well. We have our different movements, and those are movements to movements, not just hours. Sometimes it's a matter of minutes. Your rhythm is going somewhere. You need to catch the train while it's running. You cannot catch it 1 minute later or 1 minute earlier. And this is all about balance. I mentioned the cerebellum the other day. The cerebellum is the device within our brain that regulates all this. And here movement is exactly the same as thinking and movement, bodily movement. And to get a better bodily movement, to improve your use, you need to regulate your emotional status. You need to regulate your thinking, and that takes planning, that takes naming things. I think the body is very good here, because that's the intellectual capacity. And I would say, looking into that terminology from Indian thinking, because that's something that diffuses all strands of Indian thinking, that is probably the most neglected part in Western thinking. We even perceive the consciousness that is something that should not be touched by intellect. Intellect is something you do on the outside. Meddling with your internal things with the intellect feels like something artificial, a construct. And we do have a very great resistance in the West of doing such a thing. It's, I don't know, it's similar to hitting a child, and this is of course one of the reasons so many philosophers, not only Rousseau, thought that the untamed person were the best one, because they were the original. They have the pure presence of consciousness, because they never intellectualize their own feelings. Whereas in the East it's just the opposite. You usually don't intellectualize what's around you to that extent, but you do that incredibly much when it comes to the inner world. Their body or the intellectual capacity is sine qua non for all human beings. And that is most obvious in their languages. Sorry about the noise and sorry about the sun. I didn't think it would turn up behind me. Well, that's also one thing that's actually gave me an idea here. There is an interesting connection between emotional regulation, thinking regulation, and what's going on outside ourselves. The same sequencing power that you learn afterhand by time is what you use outside. And thinking before something is done, or planning those things that Rousseau and other people would think to be so horrible to do to yourself. And of course Descartes wouldn't even be able to do, because he thought everything that he thought was himself. The idea of identity ruled his life, and that possibility, of course, for him was something completely out of the vision. Could be compared to a person that is, as we say in Swedish, utåtagerande. And this is something that's getting more common in the West. It's young kids who only reacts, and they don't have any controlling power of their own intellectual, emotional, or sensitive life. Notice this change in voices. You can often hear among young people today, that's a non-regulated voice that doesn't disclose the person's emotional state in a very good manner. It sounds monotonous. It brings constantly the same force, and it's almost like an unstrung guitar or a flute that's out of the rhythm or harmony. I think that's a good metaphor what we're striving for, and this is a metaphor we often find in Indian literature as well. I talk about prana, and prana is the balance factor. You can call it the constant. That will be quite alright, because intellectualizing about your inner life is allowed in Indian thinking. And you can call that a constant, a mathematical constant, and that constant can develop and enlarge itself. That would mean that you will have more things that you can control outside yourself. And I say control, that counts for perception as well, because the perceptive powers are actions. Everything in our system could be said to be actions, and you will perceive more. So the whole idea that we all perceive the same amount of things is absolute foundational in Western thinking, because otherwise everything is going to crack with a world that is constantly existing outside ourselves and so forth. That we know to be a complete myth. You construct your world, and you can construct more, you can construct less. You can have more reality, and the more you emotionally regulate yourself, the more real and the more shared is your reality with other people. You get down to the real stuff in reality. Whereas if you have these ideas of the Gettier problem, or brain in the vat, and the hare and the tortoise, you are shying away from the world. You are looking somewhere else. And of course there is a learning curve here. Just to discover at an advanced stage these things, I think it's quite amazing. But it's also tough. I would say it is even so tough, it's hard to discover what is an internal thought or what is something going around outside, because we don't really do that distinction. Probably you all say now, hey, you said there is complementary, these distinctions between outside and inside. And you would say, hey Hans, what happened to autopoiesis of Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela? Well, that is more of showing complementarity is the absolute prerequisite to have a distinction. And that's one of the other things coming from quantum mechanics, for instance. So the distinction is to be made there. And we also need to, in the beginning, loosen up this philosophical distinction to get into the real thing, the real McCoy, what is beneath, what is really important, and that makes a whole lot of difference. And that's the internal viewpoint, because that is what decides what you will perceive, what you will do in the world, how well you function. And in the end, when it's working well, you can see that with kids, when they start to learn to regulate, they get happier, they get more interested, and at the very same time, both things happen. And that is, they get more interesting in the world, but also get more interested in what's happening inside of them. Whereas they lose, they don't develop to the same degree the inner capacity to regulate themselves, they will also lose interest in the outer world. So there is a complementarity going on here. And of course we are at a disadvantage. Our language doesn't have phrases for this. We have never trained this before. Even the word emotional regulation is more or less new. There are other terms I will introduce here in later lectures. But we are still way ahead of poor old René Descartes, because he would have never gotten there. He was sort of already locked into a corner where there was no escape. And in a way, that it wouldn't have mattered that he died at an early age, 55 I think it was. It wouldn't have mattered, because even if he spent another 30-40 years, he would not be able to unlock the Gordian knot that sort of locked his intellectual endeavor. You need to understand you are not your thinking. I think that is mostly important. Once you start believing that you are your own thoughts, you go into a senso unico. It doesn't lead you anywhere. So we are at an advantage in our trip to this most peculiar world of our inner self, our most important part of ourselves, I would say. And do not fear to intellectualize. Look at the Asian, they all do it, they all regulate, they all put in categories what's inside of them. They sequence them, they sequence their reactions. Everything is incredibly controlled. And I would say that everybody in West would say that sounds horribly anal retentive for the inner side. But trust me, it's not. Spontaneity can only come into the picture when everything is controlled. And that's another of these complementarities that we as Westerners have incredibly hard to accept because of what I mentioned before. It is the consciousness for us is a living thing. It shouldn't be touched. It's like a phantasma. We are victims of the original Greek idea of the psyche, the Atman, that developed after the time of the Iliad and the Odyssey. We are victims for that idea of this freshness in consciousness. and we don't have to be, because every thought is soulful in itself, and the intellect is sacred, I would say. It is a holy thing in India. It should be here too, and it should be put to good use, because the more you use it, the more you sharpen that skill, and you have a lifetime to develop that. So go ahead and do it. Well, I roundabout here. I apologize for the sun getting behind my back. That was something I could have possibly noticed with a little bit more of emotional regulation. I say thank you very much and wish you a pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.